In the final chapters of the Book of Enoch, before the manuscript ends, there's a section most Christians have never heard read aloud, a direct address written not to the men of Enoch's own generation, but to a generation that had not been born yet. Enoch does not simply warn of an ending in vague terms. He describes a specific kind of world, a specific kind of person living in it, and states plainly that this is the generation who will see what comes next. The Book of Enoch was removed from the Bible by the Council of Laodicea in 364 CE. For 17 centuries it stayed out of reach. Then in 1947, fragments of it surfaced among the Dead Sea Scrolls, more copies than survive of several books that remained in your Bible. And inside those fragments is a letter, addressed across a gap of thousands of years, describing the exact conditions of the world its intended readers would recognize as their own. The account sits in chapters 91 through 104 of Enoch, in the section scholars call the Epistle of Enoch, one of the latest composed portions of the text but preserved alongside the oldest material in the same manuscript tradition. Fragment 4, Q212, held at the Israel Museum's Shrine of the Book, preserves substantial portions of this section in Aramaic, and paleographers have dated the script to the 1st century BCE, placing it firmly within the Second Temple period, over a century before the Gospel of Matthew was written. A second fragment, 4Q211, preserves overlapping material from the same chapters, giving scholars two independent Aramaic witnesses to cross-check against the later Ge'ez tradition. Dr. George Nicholsberg, whose 2001 commentary on 1st Enoch remains the standard scholarly reference, characterized the epistle as marking a shift in tone from the visionary narrative of earlier chapters into something closer to a letter with a named recipient, except the recipient is not named by person, but by era, and addressed to future generations rather than to Enoch's own contemporaries. Dr. Loren Stukenbrook of Ludwig Maximilian University in Munich, whose critical edition of the epistle remains widely cited among specialists, has noted that the Aramaic verb forms used throughout chapters 100 through 104 consistently address a future-oriented you, a grammatical feature distinct from Enoch's address to his own sons earlier in the text. This grammatical structure is unusual enough within Second Temple literature that some early form-critical scholars debated whether the epistle was composed later than the rest of Enoch specifically to accommodate it, a question later Qumran fragment discoveries have helped narrow, since portions of the same material appear in Aramaic copies, dated no later than other sections of the corpus. The epistle opens with Enoch gathering his descendants and telling them plainly that what follows is not for them, but for a distant future. Chapter 91, verse 1 has him state that he speaks to his children for the generations of the world, a phrase Dr. Nicholsberg notes appears nowhere else in the Enochic corpus with this specific grammatical construction, marking a deliberate shift from the personal to the universal and time-displaced. What follows across the next several chapters is not abstract. Enoch describes specific social conditions that will mark the final generation, and the specificity is what has drawn the most scholarly attention. Chapter 100 verse 2 describes a time when the father shall be smitten with his sons in one place, and brothers shall fall together in death. Language scholars have connected to a breakdown of inherited loyalty within families themselves, not merely external conflict but internal fracture, generation against generation within the same household. Chapter 91, verse 7 describes a period in which unrighteousness, sin, blasphemy, and violence increase, alongside what the Ge'ez text specifically names as apostasy, a term Ethiopian manuscript tradition uses to describe not simply wrongdoing, but the abandonment of previously held truth, people who once knew better choosing otherwise. Dr. Ephraim Isaac, whose 1983 Oxford translation is considered the most faithful rendering of the Ge'ez, noted that this term's placement alongside violence and blasphemy, rather than as its own separate category, suggests the text treats abandonment of truth as functionally equivalent to active wrongdoing, not a lesser failing but the same category of collapse. Here is what most Western summaries condense into a single generic warning. Chapter 94, verse 6 through 7, does not simply say the wicked will be judged. It specifies a particular kind of wickedness the text treats as most characteristic of this final period. Those who build their houses through the oppression of others, who acquire wealth through what the Ge'ez terms the sweat of another's labor, and who trust in that wealth as though it were permanent. The text does not condemn wealth itself. It condemns wealth acquired through a specific mechanism, extraction from others without return, and trusted in as though consequence does not apply to it. Chapter 97, verse 8 through 10 addresses this group directly in second person, telling them they will say in their hearts that they possess everything and nothing can touch them. And the text response is immediate and specific. Your riches shall not remain, but shall speedily ascend from you, not destroyed by outside force. The text specifies the wealth itself becomes unstable, a detail scholars have puzzled over, since it describes an internal collapse of value rather than external seizure. Chapter 98 adds a detail that expands this theme beyond wealth alone. Verses 4 through 8 describe a specific charge against those who, in the Ge'ez phrase Dr. Isaac renders most literally, create sin and cause it to be reckoned as though it did not originate with them, a description scholars have connected to systems of blame, displacement rather than individual wrongdoing, harm that persists specifically because those responsible for it have arranged matters so consequence lands elsewhere. Dr. Stuckenbrook's commentary notes that this passage sits among the sections of the Enochic corpus, where the text describes sin as something actively structured to be untraceable rather than simply hidden or denied. A distinction the Aramaic grammar supports through a causative verb, form used only a handful of times elsewhere in the text. This section of the epistle is structured around a repeating literary form scholars call the woes, a series of direct addresses beginning with the formula "woe to you," and naming a specific category of wrongdoer, echoing a prophetic convention found elsewhere in Second Temple Jewish literature, but concentrated here with unusual density, 7 distinct woes across chapters 94 through 104, each targeting a different failure: those who build on injustice, those who trust in riches, those who speak against righteousness, those who write false words, those who cause others to stumble. Dr. Nicholsberg has noted that the 7-part structure is almost certainly deliberate, mirroring the same numerical patterning that governs other sections of the Enochic corpus, where 7 consistently marks completeness. A 7-part indictment in a text elsewhere organized around cycles of 70 and cycles of 10 is not incidental. It is the text's way of signaling that this list is meant to be exhaustive, the complete catalog of what marks the final corrupted age, not a partial or illustrative sample. What most popular summaries compress into general condemnation, more recent critical work on the Ge'ez restores a texture that R. H. Charles's 1906 translation, still the version most widely available in English, tends to flatten into broader, less specific language. Chapter 100 and verses 10 through 13 describe the wicked being unable to escape judgment, and where Charles's English renders this in general terms, translators working more directly from the Ge'ez, including Dr. Isaac, note that the passage names specific categories of testimony against the wicked. The moon, the sun, and the stars are described as bearing witness against those who abandon truth for injustice. This detail, present in the Ge'ez and reflected in the Aramaic fragments, but easy to lose in translations that prioritize readability over precision, treats the natural world as an active participant in the final accounting rather than simply a backdrop to it, a detail with real interpretive weight that gets compressed when translators aim for a smoother English sentence. What makes this passage difficult for modern readers to dismiss as vague ancient moralizing is how closely its description of social breakdown matches documented, measurable patterns in contemporary research. Pew Research Center has tracked American institutional trust continuously since the late 1950s, when roughly 70% of Americans said they trusted the federal government to do the right thing most of the time. By the late 1970s, that figure had fallen to around a quarter, and it has not meaningfully recovered since, sitting near historic lows through the 2020s according to Pew's most recent polling. Gallup's parallel confidence surveys, tracking institutions from the presidency to organized religion to the press, show a similar decades-long decline that researchers at the Pew Charitable Trust have described as accelerating rather than leveling off in recent years. The epistle's description of a generation marked by internal fracture and by abandonment of previously held truth, not simple ignorance of it, but active departure from what was once accepted, describes in ancient terms a pattern institutional researchers can now document with 70 years of continuous survey data. Erosion that does not reverse, only deepens. A second and more directly relevant point of contact comes from historical economics. In 2024, a study published in Nature Communications by researchers including Guido Alfani of Bocconi University and Walter Scheidel of Stanford University compared income inequality across the ancient Roman and Han Chinese empires, both built on economies the researchers characterized as extractive, wealth drawn upward from subject populations rather than generated through broadly shared productivity. The study found both empires reached levels of inequality that historians increasingly connect to their eventual instability and collapse, with wealth concentrated among a small elite while the base of the economy that ultimately supported that wealth eroded beneath it. Separately, research into the 2007 to 2009 Great Recession has documented that when large-scale wealth destruction did occur in the modern era, it struck with disproportionate speed and severity, wiping out in roughly 2 years wealth gains that had taken over a decade to accumulate and falling hardest on those with the least security to begin with. Neither of these bodies of research was written with Enoch in mind. But the pattern Chapter 97 describes, wealth built on the extraction of others' labor, trusted in as permanent, then subject to sudden rather than gradual loss, is the same pattern historians and economists now document independently, separated from the text by language, geography, and 2,000 years. A third parallel concerns the mechanism Chapter 98 describes, sin arranged so its origin cannot be reckoned to those responsible. Social psychologists have studied a closely related phenomenon since the 1960s, when Bib Latane and John Darley's foundational research on what they termed diffusion of responsibility demonstrated that individuals feel measurably less personally accountable for a harmful outcome, as the number of people who could plausibly share that responsibility increases. Later, organizational researchers have extended this finding into corporate and bureaucratic settings, documenting that harm embedded in complex structures, where responsibility is distributed across enough roles that no single actor can be clearly identified, tends to persist longer and cause more damage, precisely because accountability itself becomes diffuse. The epistle's description of wrongdoing, deliberately structured so it will not be reckoned to its source, describes, in the vocabulary available to a Second Temple author, the same underlying mechanism researchers would not formally document for another 2 millennia. A fourth point of contact concerns the specific claim in Chapter 100 that fracture will occur within families themselves, not only between strangers. The General Social Survey, conducted continuously in the United States since 1972, has tracked a related measure for decades, the share of Americans who say most people can be trusted. That figure has declined significantly since the survey began, and more recent waves of the survey, along with related academic analyses, have found the decline extending into closer relationships as well, with researchers documenting weakening measures of generalized social trust across income levels and age groups alike. The epistle does not describe strangers turning on strangers. It specifies fathers and sons, brothers against brothers, a fracture inside the smallest and most durable social unit available to the ancient world. That the modern data shows trust eroding at the interpersonal level, not merely the institutional one, is not something the text could have anticipated through observation of its own era. Family loyalty in the Second Temple period was, if anything, more structurally reinforced than trust in distant governing institutions. A text predicting that the deepest fracture would eventually reach even that layer was describing a condition its own society had little reason to expect. None of these 4 points of contact, institutional trust, wealth instability following extraction, diffusion of responsibility, or interpersonal trust erosion, proves the epistle was written with foreknowledge of any specific century. What they show is narrower and, in its own way, more interesting. A Second Temple text describing social collapse in terms researchers across separate disciplines, using data collection methods unavailable for 2,000 years, would later find useful for describing measurable real conditions. The vocabulary is ancient. The categories it sorts collapse into are not. The suppression of the epistle's final generation address follows the familiar sequence, but with a detail specific to this section that historians of the text have noted separately. The Council of Laodicea removed Enoch from recognized scripture in 364 CE, and the surviving conciliar notes cite material exceeding what has been revealed. Language scholars have connected specifically to texts that claim to address future readers directly, a category early church authorities treated with particular caution, since it implied ongoing revelation rather than a closed prophetic record. Jerome, compiling the Latin Vulgate around 400 CE, referenced Enoch by name in his commentary on Jude, which directly quotes the epistle's material and acknowledged its early circulation among Christian communities, but excluded it regardless. Writing that texts claiming to address unnamed future generations risked being applied by each reader to his own age, a concern Jerome states explicitly rather than leaving implied. Augustine in the City of God addressed prophetic material of this kind directly, arguing that specific addressable warnings meant for a named future generation rather than general moral instruction risked encouraging exactly the kind of self-application Jerome had warned against. Readers of every subsequent era each concluding the warning was written for them. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church preserved the complete epistle without interruption through its Gaze manuscript tradition, and it is through monasteries such as Axum that the full address to the generations of the world survives intact today. When James Bruce brought Gaia's manuscripts to Europe in 1773, the epistle's direct address to an unspecified future audience drew particular scrutiny from Oxford scholars in the following decades, who treated open-ended, future-directed, prophetic material with more caution than material addressed to a specific historical audience, on the grounds that such passages could too easily be read by any generation as being written for them, specifically. Joseph Milik, overseeing the early Qumran publication effort, placed Fragment 4 Q212 and related epistle material among the later released portions of the Enoch corpus, and his 1976 critical edition, when it finally appeared, treated the section's consistent future-directed grammar as one of the more difficult interpretive problems in the corpus to resolve conclusively, since the text does not name the specific era it addresses and offers no internal marker that would fix it to one moment rather than another. That ambiguity, whether original to the text or a product of how it was transmitted, is itself part of why the epistle has drawn less popular attention than the Watcher's narrative or the dream visions, despite being preserved with the same care across the same manuscript tradition. It is worth pausing on why scholars have found this section so difficult to simply set aside as generic warning. Dr. Nicholsberg has noted that unlike apocalyptic material elsewhere in Enoch, which tends to describe cosmic signs, celestial disruption, visible and external, the epistle's markers of the final generation are almost entirely social and internal. Fractured families, abandoned truth, wealth built on extraction, sin engineered to be untraceable. None of these require a miracle to recognize. They require only that a reader look at the conditions the text describes and ask whether they match what is currently observable. This is, according to Dr. Stuckenbruck, precisely what made the passage dangerously adaptable to the 19th century Oxford scholars who first flagged it. A set of criteria specific enough to feel diagnostic, yet general enough that multiple generations across 2,000 years of transmission could each in turn conclude the description fit their own moment better than the moment before it. Now let me be clear, I am not saying this text was written with a specific calculable date in mind, or that Enoch could name any particular year, decade, or living person. The epistle's account passed through centuries of transmission and translation before reaching the Aramaic fragments and Ge'ez manuscripts scholars study today, and what a Second Temple author intended by addressing the generations of the world is something the surviving evidence cannot narrow to a single moment with certainty. But what the text preserves, in its own words, in fragments older than the New Testament, is not a vague moral lesson aimed at no one in particular. It is a direct address, grammatically distinct from Enoch's own time, describing internal fracture within families, the abandonment of known truth rather than simple ignorance of it, and wealth built through extraction and trusted in as permanent, only to become unstable with a speed the text insists is deliberate rather than accidental. The fragment that contains this address is still under glass in Jerusalem. The complete epistle is still copied by hand in Ge'ez in Axum. And the question the earliest church authorities tried to close off by excluding the text, whether the generation it describes has already arrived, is still sitting in the manuscript, addressed to whoever reads it next, waiting for someone to decide if it was written for them.